Have you ever felt like you had to apologize for simply existing? Like every time you stood tall, someone called you intimidating. Every time you spoke your truth, they said you were too much. Every time you walked away, they whispered that you were cold. So you shrank, you softened your tone, you made yourself smaller so they could feel bigger, and they called that maturity. They called that love. But it wasn't. It was training. It was silence disguised as peace. And somewhere in that silence, you began to question your strength. You began to wonder if confidence was cruelty, if clarity was arrogance, if needing space meant you were broken. But here's the truth. You were never the problem. They just didn't know what to do with someone who didn't beg to be understood. And when they couldn't shrink you, they tried to shame you. You're not weak. You were just taught to feel guilty for the power they couldn't control. Guilt wasn't something you chose. It was something they gifted you over and over again until you wore it like a second skin. It started with small sighs when you said no, raised eyebrows when you asked for space, a tone shift when you dared to say what you wanted. And before you had the words to name it, you had already learned how to carry it, like a whisper that followed you everywhere. You're being selfish. You're overreacting. Why can't you just be more like? And so, you adapted. You swallowed your truth to keep the peace. You apologized for things you didn't do. You stayed longer than you should have, loved harder than they deserved, gave more than you had, all because somewhere along the way, you were taught that being powerful meant being a problem, that choosing yourself was betrayal, that saying no meant you didn't care. But the truth is, they never wanted your weakness. They wanted your obedience. And when you gave it, they called it love. But when you stopped, even slightly, they called it cruel. That's how you learned that love was conditional, that your worth was transactional, that your goodness had to be earned again and again by how little of yourself you kept. And so guilt became your leash, not because you lacked strength, but because you were punished every time you used it. They didn't have to control you directly. They just had to convince you that your strength hurt people, that your truth made things harder, that your emotions were an inconvenience, that your presence, in its full, unapologetic form, was too heavy for the room. So you dimmed, smiled, nodded, shrunk. You said yes with a trembling throat and a heart that screamed no. You showed up for people who never showed up for you. Not because you were weak, but because guilt told you that leaving would make you the villain. That's what no one tells you. The villain in your story isn't always the loud, obvious abuser. Sometimes it's the one who smiles as they make you feel like your boundaries are punishments, like your silence is violence, like your distance is cruelty. They don't say it directly, they imply it, through disappointment, through silence, through subtle withdrawal, until your nervous system becomes fluent in self-betrayal just to avoid that awful feeling that you made someone uncomfortable. That's how guilt works. It turns your truth into a threat, your needs into burdens, and your power into shame. But here's the quiet, devastating truth. The guilt you carry isn't yours. It never was. It was handed to you by people who didn't want to grow, by people who feared your no because it meant they had to face themselves, by people who benefited from your silence, your effort, your availability. And the moment you started pulling back, not out of hate, but out of self-respect, the guilt came crashing in. Because guilt doesn't attack you when you're breaking, it attacks you when you're healing. It creeps in, not when you're people-pleasing, but when you finally stop. And if you're not careful, it tricks you into going back to the conversations that drained you, the relationships that used you, the patterns that buried you. But you are done. You are done apologizing for the space you take up. You are done shrinking to make others feel big. You are done confusing guilt with guidance. Because guilt is not a compass, it's a cage. And you're not here to live in a cage made of other people's expectations. You are allowed to walk away from what doesn't honor you. You are allowed to say no and not explain it. You are allowed to feel heavy emotions without being punished for them. You are allowed to protect your energy without justifying it. And most of all, you are allowed to be powerful without guilt. Because your power is not violent. Your clarity is not cruel. Your truth is not an attack. If it shakes someone, let it shake them. If it disappoints them, let them sit with it. That's not your burden. Your job was never to make everyone comfortable. It was to be whole. And now, for the first time in a long time, you are beginning to feel the difference between guilt and truth. One keeps you small, the other sets you free. And from now on, you don't run from guilt, you examine it. You ask, who gave this to me? And if the answer is someone who used your kindness for control, you let it go. You let it burn. Because the truth is, if guilt is the price of your power, then it was never love to begin with. It was control. And you are done being controlled. In the next section, we'll step into the moment it all changes, the quiet turning point where you stop asking for permission and begin remembering who you really are. It didn't come with lightning, no grand explosion, just quiet, a moment. You were standing in a room you no longer belonged to, surrounded by people who once felt like home, now staring through you like fog. You said less than usual, smiled less, didn't nod just to make things easier, and no one noticed. That's when it hit you. They never saw you, only the version of you that made their world more comfortable. And for the first time, you didn't feel pain about it. You felt clarity, like something inside you finally exhaled. This was the shift, not the loud kind, the kind that unfolds in silence, the kind that doesn't beg for applause. You didn't scream, you didn't argue, you didn't explain. You just stopped performing, stopped chasing, stopped carrying conversations that made your chest ache, stopped saying I'm fine when you weren't. You didn't owe the world your constant softness anymore. You remembered you could be whole without being available. You remembered that protecting your peace didn't make you cold, it made you wise. You remembered that boundaries weren't walls, they were doors with locks, and not everyone deserves a key. You remembered how your younger self used to speak without fear, how your body used to move without bracing for judgment, and how that version of you still lived somewhere beneath the layers of guilt, people-pleasing, and chronic self-erasure. And for a split second, you felt her again. Wild, electric, undimmed, not reckless, just real. And realness felt like rebellion. You realized how long you had betrayed yourself for the illusion of safety. How often you said yes when your whole body said no. How you watered dead plants and called it compassion. How you stayed in places that drained you because leaving felt mean. But now you saw it. None of that was love. It was fear in disguise. Fear of being alone. Fear of being too much. Fear of being judged. And in that moment, the fear didn't vanish, but it stopped owning you. You remembered you were allowed to walk away without offering a PowerPoint presentation. You were allowed to change without checking if it made others uncomfortable. You were allowed to grow into someone unfamiliar, even to yourself. Because that unfamiliarity, that's not confusion, that's rebirth. You remembered that your silence doesn't mean defeat, it means discipline. That your tears don't mean weakness, they mean you're alive. That your fire isn't too much. It's just too bright for people who refuse to open their eyes. You remembered that healing isn't always loud. Sometimes it's sitting alone in a quiet room, choosing not to go back, even when you're lonely. You remembered that you are not the opinion others have of you. You are not the version they created to feel in control. You are not responsible for how they respond to your truth. You remembered that the guilt isn't yours, it's inherited, handed down like a curse. And with every breath you take in your own power, that curse loses its grip. You remembered that the same power they mocked is the power they feared. And that fear, that was always the clue. They don't try to guilt people who are truly weak. They target the strong ones, the ones who might break the cycle, the ones who might walk away. The ones who might finally say, no more. You are that one. And now, everything is different. Not because the world has changed, but because you see it for what it is. You don't trust words the way you used to. You trust patterns, energy, silence. You don't beg for clarity. You create it. You don't explain your worth. You embody it. You don't rush to prove your heart. You sit in your truth and let it speak without sound. This is the remembering, the quiet return to your original self, before the world shamed you, before they shaped you, before they taught you that your light should be dim to make others feel tall. No more. You are not here to be agreeable. You are not here to be pleasing. You are not here to be quiet so others can be loud. You are here to be whole. And wholeness is not soft edges. It's fierce clarity. It's choosing yourself in a world that taught you that was selfish. It's being kind without being consumed. It's standing firm, even when your knees shake. You don't owe anyone the version of you that forgets yourself to make them comfortable. That version is gone, buried in the silence that set you free. In the next section, we'll define what real power looks like. Not the loud kind that needs to be seen, but the quiet kind that doesn't flinch, doesn't beg, and doesn't ask for permission. You used to think power was loud, something that had to shout, dominate, win every argument, command every room. But that wasn't power, that was noise. Real power doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need to. Real power walks into a room and doesn't shrink, doesn't explain, doesn't chase approval. It just is. It's presence without performance. It's knowing you can speak and choosing silence because peace is louder than any defense. You used to think clarity was cold, that it hurt people, but it only hurt those who benefited from your confusion. Your power doesn't come from how many people admire you. It comes from how many people you no longer need approval from. And now you no longer explain your distance. You no longer rush to fix the discomfort in others when your truth shakes them. You are not ice. You are solid ground. Steady, still, clear. And that kind of presence, it's terrifying to people who built comfort around your doubt. They miss the version of you that hesitated, the version that flinched when they were disappointed, that scrambled to smooth the air after speaking a truth. But that version doesn't live here anymore. You don't whisper your boundaries like secrets. You state them like facts, calm, grounded, unmoved. That's the kind of clarity that makes people shift in their seats. You don't chase clarity from others anymore because you've built it within. You've learned that anyone who needs you to dilute your truth for their comfort is not someone who honors you. Anyone who only respects your silence when it serves them doesn't deserve your voice when it rises. You've stopped asking, will they still love me if I change? Because now you ask, do I still love myself when I don't? And that question changes everything. You see, power isn't about being above others. It's about no longer being beneath yourself, no longer stepping out of your own light just to keep someone else from feeling insecure. You can be kind and still have unbreakable standards. You can love deeply and still leave when your peace is compromised. You can be soft without being walked on. Your strength was never the problem. Their comfort with your weakness was. And now that you've reclaimed it, they feel it. You don't flinch when they withdraw. You don't panic when they misunderstand. You let them, because you finally realized the people meant for you don't require you to betray yourself to keep them close. And the ones who do, let them go. Let them be confused. Let them gossip. Let them spin stories about how you've changed, because you have. And thank God you did. The old you would have chased them down with explanations, apologies, proof of your goodness. The new you don't prove your worth. You embody it. You move differently now. Not with arrogance, but with ownership. You sit in your silence like a throne. You don't rush. You don't beg. You don't overextend. You say no and don't fill the air with reasons. You walk away, not to punish, but to preserve. You don't close doors in anger. You simply don't leave them open for drafts. You've learned that real power isn't reactive. It's rooted. It doesn't erupt. It endures. It doesn't push. It pulls. You've become magnetic in your stillness, and people feel that. Some are drawn to it, others are threatened by it, but none can ignore it. Because presence speaks, even when you don't. And that's what they don't understand. You don't need to yell to be heard anymore. You don't need to cry to be seen. You don't need to prove you were hurt to validate your distance. You just are. And that clarity, that quiet, unwavering clarity, is power. You've stopped arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you. You've stopped lowering your standards just to feel less alone. You've stopped seeking peace outside yourself, because now you are the peace. And it's not always soft. Sometimes peace is a locked door, a phone left unanswered, a truth told without apology. Sometimes peace is saying, I don't owe you access to me. That's what power is, not the ability to control others, but the refusal to let others control your sense of self. And yes, some will call it cold, some will call you distant, some will say you've changed. Let them. Because power doesn't argue with projections. It doesn't shrink for approval. It simply shines and lets the rest adjust or walk away. And if they walk away, let them. Because anyone who can't honor your clarity was only ever attached to your confusion, and you're done being confused. You're done dimming yourself to be digestible. You're done living in rooms where your power makes others nervous. You are not too much. You are finally enough for yourself. And the moment you made peace with that, everything changed. In the next section, we'll look at what happens when they realize they can't access you anymore. How your unshakable presence becomes the very thing they fear, because they can't manipulate what they can't reach. They don't fear the version of you that apologizes too much. They don't fear the one that waits by the phone, checks the tone of every message twice, replays every conversation, wondering if you were too blunt, too quiet, too anything. They don't fear the one that bends. That version was manageable, predictable. That version cared too much about being misunderstood. But this version, the one who doesn't flinch when they leave your message on read, the one who doesn't explain the silence, doesn't soften the boundary, doesn't ask, are we okay? This version terrifies them because they don't know how to move you anymore. You used to react. You used to overcompensate. You used to check in and fix things that weren't yours to fix. Now, you're still. And stillness is power. Stillness means you've detached, not with bitterness, with clarity. It means their moods don't dictate your day. Their distance doesn't send you spiraling. Their silence no longer creates storms inside your chest. You've stopped bleeding for those who wouldn't offer you a bandage, and they don't know what to do with that. Because now they feel something foreign, consequence. They feel the weight of their absence, not because you're punishing them, but because you're not saving them from themselves anymore. You're not rushing to prove you're good. You're not chasing clarity they refuse to give. You're not playing the game, and when you stop playing, they lose control. They start watching your stories, asking about you indirectly, dropping half-hearted breadcrumbs to see if you'll bite. But you don't, because the version of you that once needed closure now lives in peace with open endings. The version that begged to be chosen now chooses themselves, daily, quietly, without theatrics. And this calm, this lack of response, unnerves them more than any anger ever could, because anger can be engaged. Silence, that's a locked door, and you hold the key. You're no longer accessible by default. You're earned, and most people never learned how to earn you. They learned how to consume you, how to drain you, how to keep you close with just enough affection to keep you confused. But confusion is no longer your home. Now you live in clarity, and that clarity is not up for negotiation. You see patterns faster now. You see motives behind smiles. You feel shifts in energy like earthquakes. And when your body says no, you listen, without guilt, without second guessing. You don't get pulled back in by nostalgia, because now you understand. The memory isn't the relationship. The apology isn't the change. The effort isn't the consistency. You've grown too wise to fall for fragments. You want fullness or nothing, and that standard, that boundary, that refusal to settle, that's what they fear. Because now they have to earn a seat at your table, and they don't know how to cook. They only knew how to eat. You were the feast, the warmth, the reassurance, the soft landing. And now, you're gone. Not in anger, not in spite, but in evolution. You didn't slam the door, you just stopped unlocking it. And every time they reach for the old you, they find silence. And silence is loud when you're used to noise. It echoes, it exposes, it confronts. They try to bait you, provoke you, because if they can make you reactive, they can believe they still matter. But you don't rise, you don't defend, you don't argue your value anymore. You know who you are now, and that knowing is unshakable. And what they can't shake, they can't shape. What they can't predict, they can't play. What they can't control, they learn to fear. Because people don't fear cruelty, they fear boundaries. They fear someone who no longer explains, no longer negotiates their worth, no longer stays when it's one-sided. You are that person now, not because you're heartless, but because you finally realized that your heart is not a bargaining chip. It's a compass, and it doesn't point back to those who broke it. It points forward, toward peace, toward wholeness, toward people who don't fear your strength, because they've done the work to meet it. And the ones who haven't, let them feel the silence, let them feel the boundary, let them feel the absence of access. It's not revenge, it's revelation, a mirror, a message, that you will no longer betray yourself for love, that you will no longer dilute your power to be digestible, that you will no longer set yourself on fire to keep others warm. If that makes them uncomfortable, good, that's where growth begins. And you've been growing in that discomfort for years. Now it's their turn. In the final section, we'll return to what they tried to make you ashamed of, your power. But this time, we'll claim it as sacred, as something that was never wrong, only misplaced in the hands of people who couldn't hold it. They told you power was dangerous, but only when you began to claim your own. They didn't say it when you were giving, pleasing, apologizing. They said it when you started saying no, when you started taking up space without asking, when you began walking away without explaining. That's when the word selfish showed up. That's when they called you cold, distant, hard to deal with. But let's be honest, they never feared your power. They feared the moment you realized it was yours. Because when you were quiet, they called you humble. When you were unsure, they called you sweet. When you were self-sacrificing, they called you loyal. But the moment you stopped performing pain for their comfort, you became a threat. And now, you understand why they tried so hard to confuse you. Why they buried you in guilt and made you question your fire. Because a person who owns their power can't be manipulated, can't be guilted, can't be shaped by shame. And now, finally, you see what they saw all along. You were never too much. You were never wrong for wanting peace, protection, clarity, distance, truth. You were just powerful. And they weren't ready, but you are. And reclaiming your power didn't require rage. It required remembrance. It wasn't about becoming something new. It was about coming home to what you always were before the world told you to hide it. Your strength is not the absence of softness. It's the presence of self-respect. It's the quiet certainty that you do not have to break just to be loved, that you do not have to bleed just to prove you care. You can be kind and sovereign, gentle and immovable. You can love and still leave, and now you do, without theatrics, without permission, without guilt. That is power, not the kind that dominates, but the kind that doesn't disappear. The kind that doesn't need validation to be real, the kind that doesn't apologize for the echo it leaves in rooms that once expected you to be small. You are not here to be digestible. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are here to be real, and realness often makes people uncomfortable. Let it, because the people who truly see you will never ask you to shrink. They won't punish you for protecting yourself. They won't confuse your clarity with cruelty. They will meet you in your fullness, not your fragments. And you You will no longer entertain those who only loved you when you were breaking yourself into pieces. You will no longer smile through your own erasure. You will no longer chase closeness that costs you your peace. You are whole now, whole in your silence, whole in your decisions, whole in your walk, your tone, your boundaries. And that wholeness, it's sacred, not loud, not showy, just steady, present, unapologetic. You no longer fold for love. You no longer bend for belonging, because you've learned the only thing worse than being alone is being surrounded by people who require your weakness to feel strong. And that's not your world anymore. In your world, power is peace, love is mutual, boundaries are honored, and guilt doesn't live here. Not because you don't feel, but because you no longer carry emotions that were never yours. You've laid them down. The guilt, the shame, the fear, the need to explain, all of it. You've traded it for stillness, for self-trust, for the kind of quiet power that speaks before you say a word, that walks into a room and sets a tone, that no longer needs to be proved, because it just is. You've returned, not to who they wanted, but to who you were before they taught you to be afraid of your light, before they told you you were too much, before they convinced you that strength was something you had to earn. You were born with it. You were just taught to forget. But now, you remember, and in that remembrance you rise, not with noise, but with presence, not with anger, but with knowing, not with apology, but with grace. This is what it means to come home to your power. And once you do, no one can take it from you again. If this felt like truth in your chest, subscribe and share it with someone who's done being guilty for their strength. Their power isn't the problem, it's the answer.